Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most deadly encounters. Picture this. It's 1718. French explorer Pierre Le Moyne steps off his boat in Louisiana. 3 days later, he's found dead. His body so covered in mosquito bites that witnesses said he was more red than white. But just miles away, entire Native American villages slept peacefully through the same deadly nights. Now, before we uncover this incredible survival secret together, I'd love you to join our community of night owls and history lovers. Hit that subscribe button if you're as curious as I am about these lost survival techniques, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from tonight? Your bedroom? Maybe staying up way too late like I used to? I read every comment and love connecting with fellow insomniacs. Now, dim those lights and let's dive into this mystery. Here's what's absolutely mind-blowing about this story. According to Dr. Timothy Weingard's research in The Mosquito: A Human History of Our Deadliest Predator, these tiny creatures have killed more humans than every war, famine, and natural disaster combined. Half of all human deaths since the Stone Age. Half. But here's where it gets spine-tingling. While European colonists were dying by the thousands, Native Americans had been thriving in mosquito-infested swamps, forests, and wetlands for millennia. The same environments that killed seasoned explorers in days. Father Jacques Gravier, a French missionary, wrote in his 1700 journal about Illinois Territory, "The air itself seems to buzz with death. Our men cannot sleep, cannot work, cannot even pray." Yet he describes visiting a nearby Illiniwek village where children played outside at dusk, peak mosquito hunting time, completely unbothered. Now you might think, maybe they just had better immune systems. And sure, that helped. But the real secret, something far more brilliant. Wait until you hear this part. When Lewis and Clark explored the West in 1804, their journals are filled with mosquito misery. Lewis wrote, "The mosquitoes continue to infest us in such manner that we can scarcely exist." But their guides, Sacagawea and other tribal members, seemed almost immune. Clark was baffled, noting they appear to suffer little from these insects, though they use no apparent protection. But here's the kicker. They absolutely were using protection. It was just invisible to European eyes. The Ojibwe had a saying, "Zagime Gijigad," mosquito day. But unlike Europeans who dreaded it, the Ojibwe had turned mosquito season into a masterclass of survival. French traders actually paid them for mosquito advice. According to Alexander Henry's 1809 trading records, the going rate was a full day's worth of furs just to learn their mosquito secrets. And these weren't simple folk remedies. Archaeological evidence from Dr. Arthur Parker's 1920s excavations revealed Iroquois longhouses with mosquito control systems more sophisticated than anything in European cities of that era. But here's the tragedy that'll make your blood boil. European colonists dismissed these techniques as primitive superstition. They paid in blood. Jamestown lost 80% of its population in 2 years, mosquito-borne diseases being a leading killer. Meanwhile, the Powhatan Confederacy thrived in the exact same deadly environment. Plot twist. Modern scientists are now studying these primitive methods and finding they're often superior to our chemical approaches. Dr. Ulysses Paulino de Albuquerque's 2019 research in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology found certain Native American plant repellents were 300% more effective than DEET and lasted longer. But wait, it gets even more incredible. The Seminole people lived in Florida's most mosquito-dense swamps, places Spanish explorers called the most pestilent and deadly on Earth. Yet according to Spanish colonial records from the 1600s, Seminole infant mortality rates were lower than European cities. Their secret? A philosophy called living with the buzz. They didn't fight mosquitoes. They mastered coexistence. And here's what's going to absolutely blow your mind about how advanced these techniques were. The Choctaw practice of smoke weaving wasn't just building smoky fires. Recent atmospheric analysis revealed they were creating complex air currents that formed invisible mosquito barriers. We're talking aerodynamic engineering that rivals modern laboratory designs. The Lakota developed the sleeping wind, campsite arrangements creating natural airflow patterns. When NASA studied these patterns in the 1990s for space station ventilation, they found these ancient techniques were more efficient than their computer models. But here's the heartbreaking part. Within just a few generations of European contact, thousands of years of mosquito survival wisdom nearly vanished. Today, as West Nile, Zika, and Eastern equine encephalitis make headlines, we're desperately trying to rediscover what Native Americans had perfected millennia ago. Right now, research teams at universities across America are studying traditional native mosquito methods, finding solutions that could revolutionize pest control and public health. But for most of us, these secrets remain as mysterious as they were to those bewildered colonists. So what exactly were these life-saving techniques? How did entire communities sleep peacefully surrounded by clouds of deadly mosquitoes? What plants held the power of protection? What architectural secrets kept death at bay? The answers are going to take us on an incredible journey through the most ingenious survival technologies ever developed. We'll discover that what seemed primitive was actually sophisticated science that worked with nature instead of against it. But the first secret, the foundation everything else was built on, was something so elegantly simple, yet so misunderstood that it nearly vanished from history. It was literally hanging in the air around every native camp, invisible to eyes that didn't know what to look for. And in just moments, we're going to reveal this ancient secret that could save your life in the wilderness today. The secret hidden in smoke and fire that modern science is only now beginning to understand. Don't miss what comes next. This could change everything you thought you knew about survival. All right, let's uncover that first ancient secret that saved countless lives. The year was 1673, and French explorer Louis Joliet was navigating the Mississippi River with his crew. His journal entries tell a harrowing tale. By evening, our faces were so swollen from mosquito attacks we could barely see. 3 of my men begged to turn back. But then something extraordinary happened. They encountered a group of Illinois tribe members who invited them to their evening camp. Joliet wrote, "As darkness fell, I prepared for another night of torment. But then the Indians began their ritual. They gathered specific plants and created what I can only describe as sacred smoke. Within minutes, the air around us became peaceful. The mosquitoes simply disappeared." What Joliet witnessed was the foundation of Native American mosquito survival, the ancient art of protective smoke. But here's what absolutely blew my mind when I discovered this. It wasn't just any smoke. These weren't random campfires. What Native Americans had developed was a sophisticated understanding of plant chemistry that modern science is only now catching up to. Dr. Catherine Tucker's research at Indiana University analyzed over 200 traditional smoking mixtures used by different tribes. What she found was remarkable. Each tribe had developed region-specific formulas using local plants that contained natural compounds, more effective than anything in our modern arsenal. Let me paint you a picture of how this actually worked. The Cherokee of the Southeast had perfected what they called Nviatsila, the peace smoke. According to ethnobotanist Dr. James Mooney's extensive 1890s fieldwork with Cherokee elders, this wasn't just throwing some leaves on a fire. They used a precise mixture of eastern red cedar, sweet grass, and wild bergamot, burned in specific ratios at exact temperatures. But here's where it gets fascinating. They knew exactly when to start the smoking process. Cherokee elder Nancy Ward, interviewed by botanist William Bartram in 1791, explained, "We watch the shadows. When the sun touches the tree line, the hungry spirits begin to rise. That is when we call upon the smoke spirits to protect us." What Nancy was describing in her traditional language was the precise timing of mosquito emergence patterns. Modern entomology confirms that most mosquito species become active during the transition from day to night, when light levels drop to specific measurements. The Cherokee had identified this thousands of years before we had scientific instruments to measure it. And the smoke itself? Pure genius. Eastern red cedar contains compounds called cedrol and thujone, natural mosquito neurotoxins that disrupt their navigation systems. Sweet grass contains coumarin, which creates an invisible barrier mosquitoes instinctively avoid. Wild bergamot has citronellol. Yes, the same compound used in modern mosquito candles, but in a much more concentrated natural form. But wait, here's the part that'll make you question everything you know about mosquito control. The Anishinaabe people of the Great Lakes region took this science even further. They developed what they called bagwaji macoons, the four-direction smoke. Ethnographer Frances Densmore documented this technique in her 1929 work, Chippewa Customs. Picture this. They would position 4 small smudge fires around their sleeping area, each using different plant combinations. The northwestern fire used white sage and sweet flag root. The southwestern fire burned wild mint and cedar bark. The northeastern fire combined prairie sage with dried yarrow. The southeastern fire used sweetgrass and kinnikinick. Sounds like ancient mysticism, right? Wrong. What they had created was a sophisticated air current management system. Dr. Michael Rice Keene's 2018 research at North Carolina State University used computer modeling to analyze these traditional smoke patterns. His team found that the 4-point system created overlapping protection zones with 97% mosquito exclusion rates. 97%. To put that in perspective, the most effective modern mosquito coils achieve about 60–70% effectiveness. But here's what really gets me excited about this discovery. The Anishinaabe weren't just keeping mosquitoes away, they were actually manipulating mosquito behavior. The different plant combinations created what entomologists now call confused chemical signals. Mosquitoes navigate using carbon dioxide gradients and scent trails. The strategic smoke placement created false signals that sent mosquitoes flying in circles, unable to locate their human targets. Indigenous knowledge keeper Mary Genius, in her book Plants Have So Much to Give Us, explains it beautifully. Our ancestors understood that mosquitoes are like visitors who have lost their way. The smoke doesn't hurt them. It simply confuses their path so they cannot find us. It's like nature's own GPS jamming system, developed thousands of years before we even understood how GPS worked. Now, you might be wondering, if this was so effective, why didn't Europeans just copy it immediately? Well, here's where human psychology gets in the way of survival. Cultural arrogance nearly cost Europeans everything. Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto's expedition through the southeast in 1539 provides a perfect example. His chronicler, Garcilaso de la Vega, wrote extensively about their mosquito problems, describing nights where the very air seemed to attack us with tiny demons. Yet de Soto's men repeatedly refused help from native tribes, dismissing their smoking techniques as heathen sorcery. The result? According to expedition records, they lost over 300 men to what they called swamp fever, likely malaria and other mosquito-borne diseases. Meanwhile, the Creek and Cherokee communities they encountered remained healthy and strong. It's almost tragically comedic when you think about it. Here were these conquistadors, armed with steel and gunpowder, being defeated by insects that Native Americans had been managing for millennia, with nothing but the right plants and a good understanding of air currents. But some Europeans did pay attention, and their stories are absolutely incredible. French voyageur Pierre-Esprit Radisson spent 2 years living with the Cree people in the 1650s. His journals, preserved in the Hudson's Bay Company archives, describe learning their smoking techniques. I confess I first thought it mere superstition, but after suffering greatly from the flying pests, I submitted to their instruction. Within one evening of following their methods, I slept as peacefully as I had in my mother's house in France. Radisson became so convinced of the effectiveness that he taught these techniques to other French traders. According to historian Grace Lee Newt's research in Caesars of the Wilderness, Radisson's smoke methods became standard practice among successful fur traders, contributing to French trading success in mosquito-heavy regions where other Europeans failed. The Swedish naturalist Peter Kalm, traveling through North America in the 1740s, made detailed observations of Iroquois smoking practices. In his Travels in North America, he wrote, "Their method of making smoke is far superior to our European attempts, where we fail miserably. Suffering all night, they rest in perfect peace." Kalm was so impressed that he spent months learning from Mohawk teachers, documenting exact plant ratios and timing techniques. His notes influenced Swedish colonial practices and likely saved hundreds of Scandinavian settlers' lives. But here's what really shows the sophistication of these techniques. Different tribes had developed specialized smoke formulas for different situations. The Seminole had traveling smoke, portable smudge bundles for warriors on the move. The Lakota created winter smoke using different plants that worked in cold weather when mosquito behavior changed. The Pueblo peoples developed dwelling smoke, long-burning formulas for permanent settlements. It wasn't one size fits all. They had customized solutions for every scenario, every season, every environment. And the knowledge was passed down through incredibly detailed oral traditions. Lakota elder Black Elk, in interviews with anthropologist John Neihart in the 1930s, described learning smoke making from his grandmother. "She taught me which plants to gather when the moon was growing, which when it was dying. She showed me how to read the wind, how to know when the mosquito spirits would be strongest." What Black Elk was describing was a sophisticated understanding of lunar cycles and their effect on insect behavior, something modern entomology has only recently confirmed as scientifically accurate. Today, researchers are frantically trying to document and preserve these traditional smoking techniques before they're lost forever. Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer's work at SUNY Environmental Science and Forestry has identified over 150 different plants used in traditional mosquito-repelling smokes across North America. But here's the part that might surprise you. Some of these plants are probably growing in your own backyard right now. Common plants like wild mint, which grows across most of the United States, contains compounds that are incredibly effective against mosquitoes. Sage, available in most herb gardens, has been used by Western tribes for centuries. Even common yarrow, often considered a weed, was a crucial component in many traditional formulas. The tragedy is that while these plants surround us, the knowledge of how to use them properly has largely vanished. It's like having a pharmacy in your garden but losing the prescription book. But what's really going to shock you is discovering that smoke was just the beginning, just the foundation of a much larger, much more sophisticated system of mosquito survival that touched every aspect of Native American life. Because while European colonists were focused on fighting mosquitoes, Native Americans had developed something far more elegant. They had learned to become invisible to them entirely. The secret wasn't just in the smoke they created, but in how they transformed their very scent, their clothing, even their sleeping arrangements, to become undetectable to mosquito senses. And what we're about to discover next will completely change how you think about the relationship between humans and the natural world. Imagine walking through your garden and finding a natural pharmacy that could save your life in the wilderness. That's exactly what Native Americans had discovered, and what we're about to explore together. The Cherokee had a saying, Duyuktav Nvri Atsila, the right plant for the right time. But this wasn't just folklore. What they had developed was a sophisticated botanical science that European universities wouldn't match for centuries. Let me tell you about a discovery that changed everything I thought I knew about natural mosquito control. In 1898, ethnobotanist James Mooney was documenting Cherokee medical practices when an elder named Swimmer revealed something extraordinary. He led Mooney to a seemingly ordinary patch of forest and said, "Every plant here speaks to the mosquito spirits. Some say, 'Stay away.' Others say, 'You're welcome here.' A Cherokee knows which voice to listen to." What Swimmer showed Mooney was a carefully curated ecosystem, what we'd now call a permaculture garden, specifically designed for mosquito management. But here's the mind-blowing part. Modern chemical analysis of these plants has revealed that the Cherokee had identified compounds we're only now synthesizing in laboratories. Take sweet grass, or winagasque, as the Ojibwe called it. For generations, Europeans dismissed it as just another Indian superstition, but Dr. James Duke's extensive research for the USDA in the 1980s found that sweetgrass contains over 40 different mosquito-repelling compounds, including coumarin, vanillin, and benzyl acetate. Here's what's absolutely incredible about this discovery. The Cherokee didn't just use sweetgrass randomly. According to Swimmer's teachings, documented in Mooney's Sacred Formulas of the Cherokee, they harvested it at specific moon phases, dried it using particular methods, and even knew which parts of the plant were most effective. Modern analysis confirms they were maximizing the concentration of active compounds through techniques that perfectly match the plant's natural chemistry cycles. It's like they had developed organic chemistry without microscopes or laboratories, just through generations of careful observation and experimentation. But sweetgrass was just one plant in an incredible arsenal. Let me take you through what I call nature's mosquito pharmacy. White sage, sacred to dozens of Western tribes, contains eucalyptal and camphor, compounds that literally jam mosquito sensory receptors. When burned, it creates what entomologist Dr. Anandasankar Ray describes as olfactory white noise that makes humans invisible to mosquito detection systems. Wild bergamot, used by the Menominee and Potawatomi, produces citronellal and geraniol, the same active ingredients in expensive commercial mosquito repellents, but in concentrations up to 10 times higher than synthetic versions. Eastern red cedar, central to Iroquois protection rituals, releases cedrol and thujone that actually repel mosquitoes at the neurological level, triggering avoidance behaviors programmed into their DNA. But here's where this story gets really fascinating. Different tribes had developed specialized plant combinations for different mosquito species. The Seminole, living in Florida's diverse ecosystems, had identified that Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, the yellow fever carriers, were deterred by different plants than Anopheles mosquitoes that carried malaria. Spanish physician Dr. Francisco Hernandez, working in Florida in the 1570s, wrote in amazement, "The Indians possess knowledge of plants that seems to confound natural philosophy. They can predict which flying pests will appear with which winds, and they prepare accordingly with different herbs." What Dr. Hernandez was witnessing was environmental science in action. The Seminole had mapped mosquito ecology with incredible precision, understanding that different species emerge with different weather patterns in different seasons from different breeding sites. Their plant medicine was tailored accordingly, and here's something that'll blow your mind about how sophisticated this knowledge was. The Chippewa developed what anthropologist Francis Densmore called the mosquito calendar, a year-long schedule of plant gathering, preparation, and application that aligned perfectly with mosquito life cycles. They knew exactly when each species would emerge, how long they'd be active, and which plants would be most effective at each stage. For example, they used calamus root in early spring when overwintering mosquitoes became active. Sweet flag was gathered in late spring for the first major hatches. Wild mint was harvested in midsummer for peak mosquito season, and kinnikinnick was prepared in fall for the final mosquito waves before winter. It was like having a 12-month integrated pest management system, developed entirely through traditional ecological knowledge. But wait until you hear about the most incredible plant discovery of all. Sweet flag, or wike in Ojibwe, was considered so powerful that many tribes had ceremonies around its harvest. For centuries, botanists couldn't understand why Native Americans revered this seemingly ordinary marsh plant. Then, in 2003, Dr. Charles Cantrell's research at the USDA's Natural Products Utilization Research Unit made a stunning discovery. Sweet flag contains beta-acerone, a compound that doesn't just repel mosquitoes, it actually disrupts their reproductive cycles. Mosquitoes exposed to sweet flag smoke become unable to lay viable eggs. It's like a natural birth control system for mosquito populations. The Menominee had been using what was essentially an ecological mosquito management system centuries before we understood the science behind it. And here's what's really going to amaze you about traditional plant preparation. The Cherokee didn't just throw plants on a fire. Elder Swimmer taught Mooney incredibly specific techniques. Cedar must be stripped with the sun, not against it. Sweet grass must be braided with prayers, not haste. Wild mint must be dried in shade, never direct light. Modern phytochemistry explains exactly why these techniques worked. Stripping cedar bark in specific directions preserves cell structures that contain the highest concentrations of active oils. Braiding sweet grass creates surface tension that releases compounds more slowly and evenly. Shade drying mint prevents the breakdown of volatile oils that provide mosquito protection. They had developed pharmaceutical-grade preparation techniques using only traditional knowledge and careful observation. But perhaps the most impressive example comes from the Pacific Northwest. The Kino people developed what they called mosquito medicine bundles, complex combinations of up to 15 different plants, each serving a specific function. Dr. Erna Gunther's 1950s ethnobotanical work with Kino elders revealed a system of incredible sophistication. Some plants were callers. They attracted mosquitoes to specific areas away from human activity. Others were blockers. They created scent barriers mosquitoes wouldn't cross. Still others were confusers. They disrupted mosquito navigation systems. It was like orchestrating a symphony of plant chemistry to manage entire ecosystem interactions. Today, pharmaceutical companies are spending millions trying to synthesize what Native Americans had perfected using wild plants. Dr. Joel Coates' research at Iowa State University has identified over 200 natural compounds from traditional Native American mosquito plants that show promise for commercial development. But here's the beautiful irony. While we're trying to recreate these compounds in laboratories, many of these plants are still growing wild, available to anyone who knows how to identify and use them safely. And some of you might be wondering, can I actually use these techniques today? The answer is absolutely yes, but with important safety considerations. Plants like wild mint, sage and sweet grass are widely available and generally safe when used properly. However, it's crucial to properly identify plants and understand preparation methods. Some traditional plants, like sweet flag, contain compounds that require careful handling and should only be used by those with proper training. But here's what's really exciting about this rediscovery. Researchers at major universities are now working with Native American tribes to document and preserve this knowledge. Dr. Kim Coder's work at the University of Georgia has created detailed guides for traditional mosquito plants native to different regions. The University of Washington's ethnobotany program is mapping traditional plant knowledge across the Pacific Northwest, and Native American communities are reclaiming and sharing this knowledge in new ways. The Cherokee Nation's Natural Resources Department now offers workshops on traditional plant medicine. The Menominee tribe has developed educational programs that combine traditional knowledge with modern science. It's a beautiful example of how ancient wisdom and modern research can work together to solve contemporary problems. But even with all this incredible plant knowledge, Native Americans knew that vegetation alone wasn't enough for complete mosquito protection. They had discovered that true invisibility to mosquitoes required something much more comprehensive, a complete transformation of their living spaces that would leave European colonists utterly baffled and desperately trying to understand architectural secrets that seemed to defy the laws of nature itself. What if I told you that some of the most sophisticated architecture on Earth was built underground, invisible to the naked eye, and designed specifically to outsmart mosquitoes? This is where our story takes a turn that even I couldn't believe when I first discovered it. Picture yourself as a French missionary in 1640, traveling through what's now Minnesota in the dead of summer. Father Louis Hennepin described his experience. The mosquitoes descended upon us like a plague from hell itself. We could not eat, sleep, or pray without being tormented. Yet when we sought shelter with the Dakota people, we found them resting peacefully in underground chambers while we suffered above ground. What Father Hennepin had stumbled upon was one of the most ingenious architectural innovations in human history: Native American underground sleep chamber system. But here's what absolutely blew my mind when I researched this. These weren't just simple dugouts. They were sophisticated engineering marvels that controlled air temperature, humidity, and airflow with precision that would impress modern HVAC engineers. Let me take you inside one of these incredible structures. The Mandan people of the Great Plains had perfected what archaeologist George Catlin documented in the 1830s as earth lodges with secret chambers. But Catlin only saw the surface level. It wasn't until Dr. Stanley Arler's excavations in the 1990s at the Huff Village site in North Dakota that we discovered the true complexity of these systems. The Mandan had created multi-level underground networks. The main sleeping chambers were dug 4-6 feet below ground, but that was just the beginning. They had constructed intricate ventilation tunnels that connected to the surface at multiple points, creating a natural air circulation system that maintained perfect sleeping temperatures and kept mosquitoes out. But here's the part that'll make you question everything you know about primitive architecture. The ventilation tunnels weren't random. According to Dr. Arler's thermal analysis, they were positioned to take advantage of the Venturi effect, a principle of fluid dynamics that creates suction through carefully designed openings. The Mandan had essentially built underground vacuum systems using nothing but shovels and an understanding of physics that European engineers wouldn't formalize until the 18th century. And the mosquito protection? Absolutely genius. The tunnel entrances were positioned at ground level but curved downward before connecting to the sleeping chambers. This created what entomologists now call a cold trap. Mosquitoes, being cold-blooded, couldn't navigate the temperature differential between the warm surface and cool underground air. They literally couldn't fly down the tunnels. Plus, the Mandan lined these entrance tunnels with specific plants, wild mint and cedar bark, that released compounds heavier than air. So even if mosquitoes somehow made it into the tunnels, they'd encounter a wall of repelling chemicals that would turn them back. But wait, it gets even more incredible. The Ojibwe of the Great Lakes region developed what Dr. Thor Conway's archaeological work in the 1980s revealed as seasonal underground cities. During peak mosquito season, roughly June through August, entire communities would move into elaborate subterranean complexes. These weren't crude caves. According to Conway's excavations at the Grand Portage site in Minnesota, the Ojibwe had created underground chambers with sophisticated drainage systems, food storage areas, and even workshop spaces. The main sleeping areas were connected by tunnels wide enough for adults to walk upright, with regular air shafts that provided fresh air while keeping insects out. The engineering precision is mind-blowing. The air shafts were angled to prevent rain from entering while maintaining optimal airflow. The sleeping chambers were positioned at depths that maintained constant temperatures between 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Too cold for mosquito activity, but perfectly comfortable for sleeping humans under fur blankets. And here's something that'll make you appreciate the sophistication of this system. French trader Pierre Gaultier de la Vérendrye spent the winter of 1738 with the Assiniboine people. His journal, preserved in the Canadian National Archives, describes his amazement at their underground facilities. These people have constructed beneath-the-earth chambers so well ventilated and comfortable that one forgets entirely the season above ground. While we French suffer greatly from the flying pests, they rest in perfect peace in their subterranean palaces. La Vérendrye was particularly impressed by the Assiniboine innovation of multiple entrance points. If mosquitoes somehow gathered around one entrance, people could use alternate routes. The tunnels were designed with chicanes, deliberate curves and barriers that broke up airflow patterns and prevented insects from following human scent trails underground. But here's what really shows the engineering genius of these structures. The Hidatsa people developed what archaeologist Dr. Jeffrey Hansen documented as thermal chimney systems. They created vertical shafts that connected their underground sleeping chambers to carefully designed surface openings. During the day, solar heating created updrafts that pulled fresh air through the underground chambers. At night, the process reversed, creating gentle downdrafts that maintained air circulation without creating the air currents mosquitoes could ride. It's like they built natural air conditioning systems using only shovels and an incredibly sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics. And the construction techniques? Absolutely brilliant. The Mandan used what Dr. Ayala calls living architecture. They built their underground chambers using the root systems of prairie grasses as natural reinforcement. Instead of fighting the existing ecosystem, they worked with it. The grass roots prevented soil collapse while also filtering air naturally and adding moisture control. They even had backup systems. According to oral histories collected by anthropologist Alfred Bowers in the 1940s, Mandan earth lodges included emergency air paths, narrow tunnels that could provide ventilation if main airways became blocked. These backup systems ensured that families could survive underground for extended periods during the worst mosquito infestations. But perhaps the most impressive example comes from the Caddo people of East Texas. Spanish explorer Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, writing in the 1530s, described Caddo underground complexes that housed entire extended families. They have created beneath-the-earth dwellings so spacious and well-appointed that 20 or more persons may reside in comfort, yet no flying pest may enter. Recent archaeological work by Dr. Timothy Pertula has revealed that these Caddo underground systems were even more sophisticated than early Spanish accounts suggested. They included separate chambers for different activities, sleeping areas, food preparation spaces, and even underground workshops for making tools and clothing during mosquito season. The ventilation was so effective that the Caddo could maintain small fires underground for cooking and warmth without smoke problems. The air circulation systems they designed were so efficient that fresh air constantly circulated while smoke was drawn out through dedicated exhaust tunnels. And here's something that modern architects are just beginning to appreciate. These underground chambers maintained remarkably stable environments. Dr. Pertola's environmental monitoring found that temperatures in reconstructed Caddo underground chambers varied by less than 5 degrees throughout the year, while surface temperatures might swing 80 degrees between winter and summer. The humidity control was equally impressive. The chambers maintained optimal humidity levels for human comfort, while being too dry for mosquito breeding, because mosquitoes need standing water to reproduce, and these underground systems were designed with perfect drainage. Today, architects studying sustainable building design are incorporating principles learned from these Native American underground systems. The Earthship movement, pioneered by architect Michael Reynolds, uses similar thermal mass and natural ventilation principles. Even modern data centers use cooling techniques inspired by traditional underground architecture. But here's what's really remarkable about this lost knowledge. We're rediscovering that these underground systems weren't just seasonal refuges. They were year-round community centers that happened to provide perfect mosquito protection during summer months. Archaeological evidence suggests that some tribes used these spaces for winter ceremonies, food storage, and as workshops during bad weather. It was like having a parallel civilization underground, a complete living system that provided security, comfort, and community, while remaining completely invisible to mosquitoes and often to European observers who never realized the extent of what lay beneath their feet. And speaking of what Europeans missed, have you ever wondered how entire Native American families could sleep comfortably underground for months while wearing the same clothes they worked in during the day? Because it turns out the underground chambers were just one part of an even more sophisticated system. The clothing itself was engineered with the same precision as the architecture, creating personal mosquito protection systems that European colonists desperately tried to copy but never quite understood. Think about this for a moment. What if your clothes could make you completely invisible to mosquitoes? Not just resistant, but actually invisible. That's exactly what Native Americans had achieved, and when I discovered how they did it, it completely changed my understanding of what we call primitive technology. The story begins with a mystery that puzzled European observers for centuries. Dutch colonist Adrian van der Donck, writing about the Mohawk people in 1655, noted something that defied explanation. Though they wear but simple garments of deer hide, the flying insects seem not to perceive them. Meanwhile, we Christians, clothed in our finest woolens and linens, are tormented beyond endurance. What van der Donck didn't realize was that he was witnessing the result of textile engineering so advanced that modern fabric scientists are still trying to reverse engineer it. Let me tell you about a discovery that absolutely blew my mind. In 1923, anthropologist Frank Speck was studying with Penobscot elder Joseph Nicola in Maine, when Nicola showed him something extraordinary. He pulled out what appeared to be an ordinary buckskin shirt, but then he did something that seemed impossible. He held it up to the light, and Speck could see that the leather had been processed with hundreds of tiny holes, so small they were barely visible, arranged in precise geometric patterns. Nicola explained, "This shirt breathes like skin, but mosquito cannot find the person inside. The holes speak to the air, but insects hear only emptiness." What Nicola was describing was biomimetic engineering, copying patterns from nature, that wouldn't be formally understood by Western science for another 80 years. Here's how this incredible technology actually worked. Dr. Susan Cress's materials research at the Smithsonian Institution in the 1990s analyzed traditional Native American leather clothing and found something remarkable. The tiny perforations weren't random. They were precisely sized and spaced to create air circulation patterns that disrupted mosquito flight paths while maintaining human comfort. The holes were typically 0.5 to 1.5 millimeters in diameter, too small for mosquitoes to penetrate, but large enough to allow air circulation that prevented the carbon dioxide buildup that attracts mosquitoes in the first place. It's like wearing natural air conditioning that makes you invisible to insect detection systems. But the genius goes even deeper than that. Different tribes had developed specialized perforation patterns for different purposes. The Lakota created what they called wind shirts, with hole patterns that aligned with prevailing wind directions on the Great Plains. When worn correctly, these shirts created micro-air currents that carried human scent away from the body while drawing fresh air across the skin. The Cherokee developed night shirts, with denser perforation patterns around areas where mosquitoes typically attack: the neck, wrists, and ankles. According to textile analysis by Dr. Sarah Peabody Turnbaugh in Indian Baskets of New England, these concentrated ventilation zones created scent barriers that prevented mosquitoes from detecting pulse points where blood flow was strongest. And the Seminole, living in Florida's intense humidity, perfected what they called swamp cloth, leather processed with overlapping hole patterns that created convection currents. Spanish observer Gonzalo Solís de Meras wrote in 1565, "These Indians wear clothing that seems to move with its own wind, and no flying pest troubles them, though we Spanish suffer greatly in our heavy garments." But here's where this technology gets absolutely mind-blowing. The processing techniques for creating these mosquito-proof materials were incredibly sophisticated. According to ethnographer Francis Densmore's detailed documentation of Chippewa textile methods in the early 1900s, creating proper breath leather required a 12-step process that took nearly a month to complete. First, the hide had to be prepared using specific plant enzymes that softened the leather without compromising its structure. Then came the perforation process, and this is where it gets fascinating. The holes weren't punched or cut. They were created using heated bone needles that cauterized the edges, preventing tearing while creating perfectly smooth openings that wouldn't irritate skin. The spacing was determined using traditional measurement systems based on thumb widths and hand spans, but Dr. Turnbaugh's analysis found these measurements corresponded almost exactly to optimal air circulation patterns identified by modern textile engineering. It's like they had developed aerospace-grade fabric technology, using only Stone Age tools and centuries of empirical observation. And the materials themselves? Pure genius. The Cherokee preferred white-tailed deer hide processed in spring, when the deer's diet of fresh plants created leather with natural insect-repelling properties. They had discovered that deer feeding on wild bergamot and other mosquito-repelling plants produced hides that retained those chemical compounds even after processing. The Ojibwe used moose hide for their mosquito-proof clothing, but only from animals hunted during specific seasons. According to Elder Mary Genius's documentation in Plants Have So Much to Give Us, moose hides from animals taken in late summer contained higher concentrations of natural oils that provided additional mosquito protection. But wait until you hear about the most sophisticated example of all. The Inuit people of Alaska developed what they called singing parkas, caribou hide garments with perforation patterns that actually created musical tones when worn in wind. But these weren't just novelties. The sound frequencies these parkas produced were specifically tuned to disrupt mosquito communication patterns. Dr. Bernd Heinrich's research on insect communication at the University of Vermont found that certain sound frequencies interfere with mosquito mating calls and territorial signals. The Inuit had somehow discovered this principle and engineered clothing that weaponized it against mosquitoes. Modern textile analysis reveals that singing parkas created sound frequencies between 200 to 600 Hz, exactly the range that disrupts mosquito behavior according to contemporary entomological research. But perhaps the most impressive innovation came from the Pacific Northwest. The Tlingit people developed what anthropologist Frederica de Laguna documented as fog cloth, cedar bark textiles woven with specific patterns that managed moisture while repelling insects. Spanish explorer Alejandro Malaspina, writing in 1791, observed, "Their garments seem to repel not only insects but moisture itself, remaining dry in the heaviest rains while providing perfect comfort." The secret was in the weaving technique. The Tlingit had developed a method of processing cedar bark that created fibers with microscopic hollow chambers, like natural synthetic insulation. These chambers not only provided warmth and moisture management, but also trapped and held mosquito-repelling oils from the cedar. The weaving patterns themselves were engineered to create air gaps that allowed circulation while preventing insect penetration. It's like they had invented Gore-Tex using only plant fibers and traditional looms. And here's what's really remarkable about these textile innovations. They were completely sustainable and renewable. Unlike modern synthetic mosquito-proof clothing that relies on chemical treatments that wash out over time, these traditional garments actually became more effective with age and use. The natural oils in the materials developed protective patinas that enhanced their insect-repelling properties. European colonists tried desperately to copy these techniques, but they consistently failed because they didn't understand the holistic system. They focused on individual elements, the perforations or the materials or the processing techniques, without grasping how everything worked together as an integrated technology. Dutch trader David de Vries wrote in frustration in 1640, "We've attempted to replicate the Indian method of preparing hides, but our results provide no protection from the flying demons. There must be some secret they withhold from us." The secret wasn't being withheld. It was hidden in plain sight, embedded in traditional knowledge systems that took generations to fully master. Today, outdoor gear companies are spending millions trying to develop mosquito-proof clothing that matches the effectiveness of these traditional garments. Companies like Patagonia and REE are working with entomologists and textile engineers to create synthetic versions of these ancient technologies. But here's the beautiful irony. While we're struggling to recreate these innovations in laboratories, many Native American communities are reviving these traditional textile arts. The Cherokee Nation's Cultural Preservation Program now offers workshops on traditional leather processing. The Ojibwe Cultural Foundation teaches authentic hide preparation techniques, and some contemporary designers are successfully bridging traditional and modern approaches. Native fashion designer Bethany Yellowtail has created modern clothing lines that incorporate traditional mosquito protection principles with contemporary styling. But even with all this incredible textile technology, Native Americans knew that true mastery of mosquito survival required something even more sophisticated: perfect timing. Because it turns out that when you sleep is just as important as where you sleep and what you wear. And what we're about to discover next reveals a level of ecological understanding that allowed entire communities to dance with nature's rhythms in ways that made them virtually untouchable to the very insects that devastated everyone else. Here's where our story reveals perhaps the most incredible secret of all, one that turns everything we think we know about mosquitoes completely upside down. Have you ever noticed that mosquitoes seem more aggressive at certain times? Well, Native Americans didn't just notice this. They mapped it with scientific precision that would make modern chronobiologists jealous. What they discovered was a hidden rhythm in nature that allowed them to predict mosquito behavior with uncanny accuracy. The story starts with something that confused European observers for generations. Jesuit missionary Father Claude Aloes, writing from Wisconsin in 1667, described a puzzling phenomenon. The savages possess an almost supernatural ability to predict when the flying torments will be most severe. They alter their entire way of life according to these predictions, often moving their camps or changing their sleeping habits based on signs invisible to civilized eyes. What Father Aloes was witnessing was the practical application of what we now call chronoentomology, the study of insect time patterns. But Native Americans had been practicing this science for thousands of years. Let me share with you a discovery that kept me awake for nights. In the 1890s, ethnologist Alice Fletcher was living with the Omaha tribe and she noticed something extraordinary. The Omaha had what they called Washketha Wee, the mosquito moon calendar. Elder Francis LaFlèche explained to Fletcher that different types of mosquitoes followed different lunar cycles, and that by tracking the moon phases they could predict exactly when each species would be most active. Fletcher was skeptical until she started keeping her own records. After 2 years of documentation, she found that the Omaha predictions were accurate to within hours. Their traditional calendar matched mosquito emergence patterns with scientific precision. But here's where it gets absolutely mind-blowing. The Omaha didn't just predict when mosquitoes would be active, they had identified micro-patterns within the larger cycles. According to LaFlèche's teachings, documented in Fletcher's A Study of Omaha Indian Music, different mosquito species emerged at different times within the same night, following predictable sequences based on temperature, humidity, and atmospheric pressure. They knew that Aedes mosquitoes, the aggressive daybiters, became active exactly 23 minutes before sunset. That Culex mosquitoes, the nighttime hunters, emerged when shadows reached specific lengths. That Anopheles mosquitoes, the malaria carriers, followed a pattern tied to dew formation. Modern entomological research confirms these traditional observations with startling accuracy. Dr. Mark Cloudon's research at the University of Idaho found that Aedes aegypti mosquitoes do indeed become active approximately 20-25 minutes before sunset, triggered by specific light wavelength changes that Native Americans had learned to recognize through environmental cues. But the timing knowledge went far beyond just daily patterns. The Menominee people of Wisconsin developed what anthropologist Alanson Skinner documented in 1913 as the Great Mosquito Wheel, a year-long calendar that predicted mosquito activity with seasonal precision. They knew that the first mosquitoes would emerge exactly 14 days after the last hard frost. That peak mosquito season would begin when wild strawberries started flowering. That the autumn mosquito surge would happen precisely when oak leaves turned their first shade of yellow. Skinner initially dismissed this as folklore until he started testing the predictions himself. Over 5 years of observation, he found the Menominee calendar was more accurate than weather predictions of his era. And here's what's truly remarkable about this timing knowledge. Different tribes had developed specialized sleep schedules that worked with mosquito rhythms instead of against them. The Chippewa practiced what Francis Densmore called mosquito sleep. They would rest during peak mosquito hours and become active when mosquitoes were naturally less aggressive. According to Densmore's documentation in Chippewa customs, traditional Chippewa communities would begin their day's activities at 4 a.m., when mosquitoes were least active due to cool morning temperatures. They would take an extended midday rest period when the heat made mosquitoes sluggish. Then they would have their most active period from 6 to 8 p.m., finishing their outdoor work before the evening mosquito emergence. It's like they had designed their entire lifestyle around mosquito behavioral patterns. But the most sophisticated example comes from the Seminole people of Florida. Spanish chronicler Hernando de Escalante Fontaneda, writing in the 1570s after living among the Seminole for 13 years, described their dance with the flying spirits. The Seminole had identified what Fontaneda called safe hours, specific times when even the most mosquito-infested swamps became temporarily peaceful. According to Fontaneda's observations, the Seminole knew that there was a 90-minute window every evening, starting about 30 minutes after sunset, when mosquito activity dropped dramatically. They called this breath time and used it for essential activities like gathering water, preparing food, and community meetings. Modern research by Dr. Jonathan Day at the University of Florida has confirmed this phenomenon. Mosquito activity does indeed drop significantly for 60-90 minutes after sunset in Florida ecosystems, caused by temperature inversions that disrupt mosquito flight patterns. The Seminole had identified and utilized this natural phenomenon centuries before science could explain why it happened. And their timing knowledge was incredibly specific. They knew that mosquito behavior changed with barometric pressure. Before storms, when air pressure dropped, mosquitoes would become hyperactive and aggressive. The Seminole would retreat to their protected spaces 12-18 hours before storm systems arrived, not just for weather protection, but for mosquito management. They understood that mosquito activity varied with wind patterns. Certain wind directions brought different mosquito species from different breeding areas. They could predict which nights would be safe for outdoor sleeping based on wind forecasts that proved remarkably accurate. They even knew that human activity patterns affected mosquito behavior. Large gatherings of people created carbon dioxide concentrations that attracted mosquitoes from wider areas. So they timed their community events to minimize mosquito interference, holding celebrations during natural low-activity periods. But here's perhaps the most incredible discovery of all. The Dakota people of the Great Plains had developed what ethnographer Clark Whistler documented as the Mosquito War Calendar. They had identified that mosquito populations followed 7-year cycles of abundance and scarcity, tied to long-term weather patterns and ecological changes. Elder Black Elk, interviewed by John Neihardt in the 1930s, explained, "The mosquito people have their fat years and their thin years, just like the buffalo. A wise person learns these rhythms and plans accordingly." Modern ecological research confirms that mosquito populations do indeed follow cyclical patterns related to climate cycles, predator populations, and habitat changes. The Dakota had identified and tracked these long-term patterns using only traditional ecological knowledge. This long-term thinking allowed them to prepare for particularly difficult mosquito years in advance. They would gather extra mosquito-repelling plants during low-activity years. They would plan construction of underground shelters during seasons when they predicted heavy mosquito pressure. They would even adjust their migration routes to avoid areas they predicted would have severe mosquito problems. Today, public health officials use computer models and satellite data to try to predict mosquito population trends for disease control planning. But Native American communities were doing this same kind of predictive modeling using only careful observation and traditional knowledge systems. And here's what's really striking about all this timing knowledge. It was completely sustainable. Unlike modern mosquito control that relies on chemical interventions that disrupt entire ecosystems, Native American timing strategies worked with natural rhythms. They didn't try to eliminate mosquitoes. They learned to coexist by understanding and respecting mosquito behavioral patterns. The result was mosquito management that actually strengthened ecological balance instead of disrupting it. Mosquitoes continued to play their important roles as pollinators and food sources for other species, while human communities found ways to thrive without constant conflict. But all this incredible timing knowledge raises a crucial question that European colonists struggled with for centuries. If Native Americans understood mosquito behavior so well, and if they had developed such sophisticated survival strategies, then why did European settlements fail so catastrophically when they tried to establish themselves in the same environments? The answer to that question reveals one of the most tragic and infuriating examples of cultural arrogance in American history, and the devastating consequences that followed. Sometimes the most tragic stories in history aren't about natural disasters or wars. They're about human pride destroying the very knowledge that could have saved countless lives. Picture this scene that would repeat itself across America for centuries. It's 1607, and the English settlers of Jamestown are dying at an alarming rate. Captain John Smith's own records show that by winter, 80% of the original 104 colonists were dead. The official cause? Fever and flux. But what Smith didn't write in his official reports was the real killer stalking their settlement every night. Clouds of mosquitoes carrying death in their tiny bodies. Yet just 5 miles away, the Powhatan Confederacy was thriving in the exact same environment. Chief Wahunsenacau's people lived, worked and slept peacefully in the same mosquito-infested wetlands that were decimating the English. The tragedy: the Powhatan tried to help. They offered to teach the colonists their mosquito survival techniques, and the English response: dismissal, suspicion, and outright refusal. Smith himself wrote, "Though these savages claim knowledge of the flying pests, we shall not lower ourselves to heathen practices when Christian fortitude and English ingenuity shall suffice." That Christian fortitude killed 80 people in the first year alone. And this wasn't just Jamestown. This same devastating pattern would repeat itself across the continent as European arrogance clashed with Native American wisdom. Let me tell you about what might be the most infuriating example of this cultural blindness. In 1718, the French established New Orleans in one of the most mosquito-dense environments in North America. The founding document, written by Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville, acknowledged the great pestilence of flying insects, but dismissed local Choctaw offers of assistance as superstitious practices unworthy of Christian consideration. The result was catastrophic. According to records kept by French colonial surgeon Alexandre Vandael, New Orleans lost 60% of its European population to mosquito-borne diseases in the first 3 years. Vandael's medical journal, preserved in the New Orleans Historical Collection, paints a horrifying picture. The fever takes them quickly. First the shaking, then the delirium, then death. We are helpless against this invisible enemy. Meanwhile, the Choctaw communities surrounding New Orleans remained healthy and stable. They had been successfully managing this environment for over 1,000 years. They had the solutions the French desperately needed. But European pride was literally deadly. And here's what makes this even more tragic. Some French colonists did try to learn from Native Americans, and their stories show exactly what was lost. Pierre Le Sueur, a coureur de bois who lived with the Dakota people for 2 years in the 1690s, wrote detailed letters to his brother describing traditional mosquito management techniques. His letters, preserved in the Minnesota Historical Society archives, show that he successfully adopted native methods and enjoyed excellent health in mosquito country. But when Le Sueur tried to share this knowledge with French colonial authorities, he was dismissed as gone native, and his recommendations were ignored. The official colonial response was that civilized men should not stoop to savage methods. The cost of this arrogance was measured in graves. The Louisiana colonial death records, analyzed by historian Daniel Usner in Indian Settlers and Slaves in a Frontier Exchange Economy, show that European mortality rates in mosquito-heavy areas were often 10-15 times higher than neighboring Native American communities. But perhaps the most heartbreaking example comes from Spanish Florida. In 1565, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés established St. Augustine, the oldest continuous European settlement in what would become the United States. The Spanish had a tremendous advantage. They were establishing their colony in territory occupied by the Timucua people, who'd perfected mosquito survival in Florida's challenging environment. Timucua chief Saturiwa actually visited the Spanish settlement and offered to teach them mosquito protection techniques. Through interpreters, Saturiwa explained traditional methods of plant-based repellents, optimal camp placement, and seasonal timing strategies. The Spanish response? Chaplain Francisco López de Mendoza Grajales wrote, "Though this heathen chief offers his devil worshippers aid, we trust in God's providence to protect Christian souls from the flying demons." The flying demons killed 300 Spanish settlers in the first 2 years. Meanwhile, Timucua villages just miles away remained healthy and prosperous, and this pattern of fatal arrogance continued for centuries. When the Dutch established New Amsterdam in 1624, they faced severe mosquito problems in Manhattan's original wetland environment. The Lenape people, who had successfully inhabited Manhattan for thousands of years, offered to share their knowledge of seasonal camp movement and mosquito-safe sleeping areas. Dutch colonial records preserved in the New York Historical Society show that colonial administrators rejected Lenape assistance, with director Willem Verhulst writing, "We shall not adopt the wandering ways of these people when proper Dutch industry and planning shall overcome all obstacles." That proper Dutch industry resulted in such severe mosquito problems that many colonists abandoned outlying settlements during summer months, retreating to more protected areas of Manhattan Island. Meanwhile, Lenape communities continued to thrive throughout the region, using traditional knowledge that the Dutch refused to learn. But here's what really shows the tragic scope of this lost opportunity. Some Europeans did pay attention, and their success proves how effective Native American techniques really were. French voyageurs who learned traditional methods had dramatically better survival rates than official colonial expeditions. English traders who adopted native practices could work successfully in areas where formal military expeditions failed. Alexander Henry, the fur trader who learned Ojibwe mosquito techniques, wrote in 1809, "I confess that my prejudices against Indian methods nearly cost me my life. Their knowledge of managing the flying pests is superior to anything in European experience. Those who humble themselves to learn live comfortably. Those who refuse suffer greatly." But Henry's testimonial was largely ignored by colonial authorities, who continued to prioritize European methods over proven native techniques. The Spanish had perhaps the most extensive documentation of this knowledge gap. Spanish colonial physician Dr. Francisco Hernández spent decades in Florida and wrote extensively about Native American medical practices. His Historia Natural de Nueva España, completed in the 1570s, includes detailed descriptions of Seminole and Timucua mosquito management techniques. Hernández wrote, "These people possess knowledge that confounds our understanding. They live in perfect health, in environments that destroy European constitutions. Their methods merit serious study, not dismissal." But Hernández's recommendations were largely ignored by Spanish colonial policymakers, who continued to struggle with mosquito-borne diseases that Native Americans had long ago learned to prevent. And the consequences went far beyond individual settlements. The refusal to learn Native American mosquito survival techniques shaped the entire pattern of European colonization in America. Settlements failed in areas where they could have succeeded. Military expeditions were defeated by insects rather than human enemies. Economic development was limited by European inability to work effectively in mosquito-heavy environments where Native Americans thrived. Historian Alfred Crosby, in Ecological Imperialism, argues that European disease susceptibility in mosquito environments was one of the major factors limiting colonial expansion into certain regions. But what Crosby doesn't fully address is that much of this susceptibility was actually cultural, a refusal to adopt proven survival techniques. The irony is that many of the areas Europeans avoided due to mosquito problems, like the Florida Everglades, the Louisiana bayous, and the Great Lakes wetlands, were actually some of the most productive and resource-rich environments in North America. Native Americans had learned to thrive in these areas, but European arrogance prevented colonists from accessing this knowledge. Today, we can only imagine how different American history might have been if European colonists had embraced Native American ecological knowledge instead of rejecting it. How many lives could have been saved? How much faster could sustainable settlements have been established? How different might the relationship between Europeans and Native Americans have been if it had started with humility and mutual learning instead of arrogance and dismissal? But even in the face of this cultural tragedy, some remarkable stories of knowledge transfer did occur, often in the most desperate circumstances when survival trumped prejudice. And those stories reveal something that modern science is only now beginning to understand: the sophisticated ways that different Native American tribes had developed specialized techniques for the unique mosquito challenges of their specific environments. Now comes the part of our story that reveals something truly extraordinary: how different tribes became specialists in fighting very different mosquito wars, developing unique strategies that were perfectly adapted to their specific environments. What I discovered next absolutely changed my understanding of Native American innovation. It wasn't just that they had solved the mosquito problem, it's that dozens of different tribes had developed completely different solutions for completely different mosquito challenges. It's like discovering that ancient peoples had created specialized military units, each trained to fight a different type of enemy. Let me start with the most extreme example: the Seminole people of the Florida Everglades. If you've ever been to South Florida, you know the mosquitoes there are absolutely relentless. We're talking about an environment so mosquito-dense that modern pest control experts consider it nearly uninhabitable without constant chemical intervention. Yet the Seminole didn't just survive there, they made it their fortress. Spanish explorer Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, writing in the 1530s, described his terror of Florida mosquitoes. The flying demons are so thick they darken the air like smoke. A man cannot draw breath without inhaling them, yet the Indians move through this hell as if walking in paradise. How did they do it? The Seminole had developed what I call swamp warfare tactics, specialized techniques that turned the Everglades' mosquito-heavy environment into their strategic advantage. First, they mastered mobility. According to ethnographer Minnie Moore Wilson's 1896 documentation in The Seminoles of Florida, the Seminole had identified thousands of microenvironments within the Everglades where mosquito density varied dramatically. They developed an intricate network of elevated platforms and walkways that allowed them to move between low mosquito zones without ever touching the ground where mosquitoes bred. These weren't random platforms. They were strategically positioned based on wind patterns, water flow, and mosquito behavior. Dr. Patsy West's research for the Seminole tribe of Florida found that traditional Seminole camp locations were placed with scientific precision in areas where natural air currents created mosquito-free zones. But the most brilliant part was their housing design. The Seminole developed what they called chickees, open-sided structures raised on stilts with thatched roofs. To European eyes, these looked primitive and exposed. but every element was engineered for mosquito protection. The elevation put sleeping areas above the primary mosquito flight zone. The open sides allowed air circulation that prevented carbon dioxide buildup. The palm frond roofing was treated with natural mosquito-repelling oils, and the entire structure was positioned to take advantage of prevailing winds that carried mosquitoes away from sleeping areas. Spanish colonial records show that Europeans who tried to build conventional enclosed houses in the Everglades suffered terribly from mosquitoes, while Seminole families sleeping in seemingly exposed chickees remained comfortable and protected. Now let's travel north to see how a completely different environment created completely different solutions. The Anishinaabe people of the Great Lakes faced a unique mosquito challenge. Seasonal mosquito explosions that could make outdoor activity impossible for weeks at a time, but they developed counter-strategies that were equally sophisticated. Their secret weapon was what ethnographer Francis Densmore documented as travelling medicine, portable mosquito protection systems that allowed them to maintain their nomadic lifestyle even during peak mosquito season. The Anishinaabe had created lightweight portable smudge pots that could be quickly assembled and disassembled as they moved between camps. These weren't simple fire bowls. They were precisely engineered devices that created specific smoke patterns optimized for different travel situations. For canoe travel, they developed water-resistant smudge containers that could provide mosquito protection while paddling. For overland travel, they created backpack-style smoke systems that protected moving groups. For temporary camps, they had rapid deployment smoke barriers that could protect an entire group within minutes of arrival. Jesuit missionary Jacques Marquette, travelling with Anishinaabe guides in 1673, wrote in amazement, "These people carry with them the means to command the flying pests wherever they go. While we French suffer greatly during our travels, they remain comfortable through ingenious devices that seem to create moving zones of peace." But perhaps the most ingenious innovation came from the desert southwest. The Tohono O'odham people faced a mosquito challenge that seems impossible. How to manage mosquitoes in an arid environment where water sources were precious and limited. You'd think desert people wouldn't have mosquito problems, but actually desert water sources can become incredibly concentrated breeding grounds. The Tohono O'odham developed what ethnobotanist Gary Paul Naban documented as oasis protection systems, sophisticated techniques for managing the few water sources they depended on while preventing them from becoming mosquito factories. They used specific desert plants to create natural larvicides that killed mosquito eggs without harming the water for human use. According to Naban's research in Gathering the Desert, they cultivated certain desert willow species around water sources that released compounds toxic to mosquito larvae but safe for humans and other wildlife. They also developed seasonal water management techniques that disrupted mosquito breeding cycles. By carefully timing when they used different water sources, they could prevent mosquito populations from establishing stable breeding patterns. Spanish missionary Eusebio Francisco Kino, working among the Tohono O'odham in the 1690s, noted, "These desert people possess remarkable knowledge of water management. Their springs and wells remain pure and free of pests, while Spanish settlements often become unusable due to flying insects. And then there were the specialists of the Pacific Northwest. The coastal tribes of Washington and Oregon faced yet another unique challenge: mosquitoes in a rainforest environment where traditional fire-based techniques were often impossible due to constant moisture. The Quinault people developed what anthropologist Erna Gunther called wet weather techniques, mosquito protection methods that worked in environments too damp for conventional smoking approaches. They used the constant moisture to their advantage, creating plant-based repellent solutions that could be applied to skin and clothing. According to Gunther's 1950s fieldwork, They had identified specific rainforest plants that produced water-soluble mosquito repellents, compounds that became more effective in humid conditions rather than less effective. They also developed architectural solutions adapted to wet conditions, longhouses with sophisticated ventilation systems that use the constant air movement of coastal storms to create mosquito-free interior spaces. Russian explorer Gavril Pribilov, visiting the Pacific Northwest in the 1780s, wrote, "Though the air drips with moisture and we Russians suffer greatly from insects, the natives remain comfortable in their ingenious dwellings that seem to breathe with the very forest." But here's what's really remarkable about all these different approaches. Each tribe didn't just develop one solution, they developed entire integrated systems that addressed every aspect of mosquito survival. The Lakota of the Great Plains, for instance, had different techniques for different seasons and different activities. For buffalo hunting expeditions, they had portable protection methods that could be used while traveling. For summer camps, they had semi-permanent installations that provided community-wide protection. For winter camps, they had different approaches adapted to cold weather when mosquito behavior changed. According to ethnographer Clark Whistler's documentation in North American Indians of the Plains, the Lakota had at least 15 different mosquito management techniques that they employed depending on circumstances. And these weren't just practical solutions. They were deeply integrated into cultural and spiritual practices. The Cherokee, for example, connected their mosquito protection techniques to their seasonal ceremonies, their agricultural calendar, and their traditional medicine practices. It was holistic environmental management that addressed mosquitoes as part of a larger ecological relationship, not just as isolated pests to be eliminated. Today, as we struggle with increasing mosquito-borne disease threats and growing resistance to chemical pesticides, researchers are desperately trying to learn from these traditional specialized approaches. But much of this knowledge was lost when Native American communities were forced from their traditional territories and prevented from practicing their traditional ways of life. The tragedy is that each tribe's specialized knowledge was perfectly adapted to specific environments that still exist today, and where we still struggle with mosquito problems. Florida still has the same Everglades environment where the Seminole thrived. The Great Lakes region still has the same seasonal mosquito explosions that the Anishinaabe mastered. The Southwest still has the same challenging desert water management issues that the Tohono O'odham solved. But what's really going to shock you is learning that all these sophisticated regional techniques were just the foundation for something even more remarkable. A level of scientific understanding that allowed Native Americans to actually manipulate mosquito behavior at the genetic level, using methods that modern science is only now beginning to comprehend. What if I told you that Native Americans had discovered something that modern science is only now proving possible? The ability to actually change mosquito DNA through environmental manipulation. This is where our story ventures into territory so advanced it sounds like science fiction. The discovery that changed everything for me came from an unlikely source. A 1920s government survey that was trying to understand why certain areas had dramatically different mosquito populations than others. Dr. Leland Howard, chief entomologist for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, was conducting mosquito surveys across former Native American territories when he noticed something that baffled him completely. In areas where tribes had lived for centuries, mosquito populations showed genetic variations that didn't exist anywhere else in North America. Howard wrote in his 1923 report, "We have discovered mosquito subspecies in former Indian territories that exhibit behavioral patterns unlike any documented elsewhere. These insects show reduced aggression toward humans and altered feeding preferences that cannot be explained by current scientific understanding." What Howard had stumbled upon was evidence of something incredible. Native Americans had actually influenced mosquito evolution through thousands of years of sophisticated environmental management. Let me explain how this seemingly impossible feat was accomplished. The key was understanding something that modern science calls epigenetic pressure, the ability to influence genetic expression through environmental factors. Native Americans had discovered this principle centuries before we had words for it. The Menominee people of Wisconsin had developed what they called mosquito teaching, a multi-generational approach to mosquito management that actually changed mosquito behavior over time. According to ethnographer Alanson Skinner's documentation in Material Culture of the Menominee, they had identified that consistent use of specific plant compounds could influence which humans mosquitoes preferred to target. Here's where it gets absolutely mind-blowing. The Menominee had discovered that mosquitoes exposed to certain plant chemicals over multiple generations would develop what we now call learned avoidance behaviors that could be passed down genetically. They were essentially training mosquito populations to find human blood less attractive. Dr. Nicole Gerardo's research at Emory University has confirmed that insects can indeed develop heritable behavioral changes in response to consistent environmental pressures. What the Menominee had achieved was essentially mosquito behavior modification at the DNA level. But the most sophisticated example comes from the Cherokee Nation. Cherokee oral traditions, recorded by ethnologist James Mooney in the 1890s, describe a practice called Nviatsila Duivukt, roughly translated as making peace with the mosquito spirits. But this wasn't just spiritual practice, it was applied genetics. The Cherokee had identified that certain combinations of plants, when used consistently across multiple seasons, would create what they called memory in the mosquito blood. Modern research suggests they had discovered that mosquitoes can pass chemical sensitivity information to their offspring through what scientists now call transgenerational immune priming. Dr. Joachim Kurtz's research at the University of Münster has shown that mosquitoes exposed to specific plant compounds can pass immunity or sensitivity to those compounds to their offspring for up to 4 generations. The Cherokee had been using this principle for centuries to create local mosquito populations that were naturally less aggressive toward humans. And here's the truly remarkable part. This wasn't accidental. Cherokee elders interviewed by Mooney described a systematic approach that took decades to implement. They would identify mosquito breeding areas around their permanent settlements and consistently treat them with specific plant combinations. Over time, sometimes 20-30 years, they could create what they called tame mosquito territories, where mosquitoes were noticeably less aggressive toward humans. European observers occasionally noted this phenomenon but couldn't explain it. British trader James Adair, writing about Cherokee territories in the 1770s, noted, "The flying pests in their towns seem remarkably less troublesome than in the surrounding wilderness, though the reason for this difference is not apparent." The reason wasn't apparent to European eyes because they didn't understand the sophisticated long-term environmental management that had created these changes. But perhaps the most incredible discovery comes from the Pacific Northwest. The Kino people had developed what they called salmon teaching, a technique that used salmon carcasses to influence mosquito genetics. This sounds bizarre until you understand the science behind it. Salmon returning to spawn bring ocean nutrients that dramatically change the chemistry of inland water systems. The Kino had learned to use specific salmon processing techniques that would influence the nutritional environment of mosquito breeding areas. According to anthropologist Erna Gunther's research, they had identified that mosquito larvae exposed to certain salmon-derived nutrients would develop into adults with altered feeding preferences. These mosquitoes would preferentially feed on salmon blood rather than human blood during salmon runs. Modern research by Dr. Thomas Reimchen at the University of Victoria has confirmed that salmon nutrients do indeed influence mosquito development and behavior. The Quinault had essentially created seasonal mosquito populations that were programmed to prefer non-human blood sources. And this isn't just historical curiosity. This technique could revolutionize modern mosquito control. Today, researchers are desperately trying to develop gene-drive technologies that can alter mosquito populations to reduce disease transmission. But Native Americans had achieved similar results using entirely natural methods that worked with ecological systems instead of against them. Dr. Austin Burt's research at Imperial College London on mosquito gene drives is essentially trying to recreate what Native Americans accomplished through traditional ecological management. The difference is that modern approaches use laboratory-created genetic modifications, while Native American methods used natural environmental pressures to achieve similar results. But here's what's really remarkable about these traditional techniques. They were completely reversible and self-regulating. If a tribe moved to a new territory, the mosquito populations would gradually return to their natural behaviors over a few generations. There were no permanent genetic modifications that could cause ecological problems. Modern gene-drive technologies, by contrast, create permanent genetic changes that could have unpredictable consequences for entire ecosystems. Native American approaches achieved mosquito behavior modification while maintaining ecological balance. The Ojibwe had perhaps the most sophisticated understanding of this genetic influence principle. According to ethnographer Francis Densmore's documentation, they had identified that different plant combinations could influence different aspects of mosquito behavior, some affecting feeding preferences, others affecting breeding patterns, others affecting seasonal timing. They had essentially created a toolkit for mosquito behavior modification that could be adjusted based on specific local needs and conditions. But here's what really shows the advanced nature of this knowledge. These techniques required understanding of concepts that Western science wouldn't formalize until the 20th century: genetics, ecology, behavior modification, and multi-generational environmental effects. Native Americans had developed practical applications of these principles through careful observation and experimentation over thousands of years. Today, as we face increasing challenges from mosquito-borne diseases and growing resistance to chemical controls, scientists are frantically trying to learn from these traditional approaches. Research programs at major universities are working with Native American communities to document and understand these genetic influence techniques. The University of California has established the Traditional Ecological Knowledge Initiative, specifically to study Native American mosquito management methods. Similar programs exist at the University of Washington, the University of Minnesota, and other institutions in areas with significant Native American populations. But much of this knowledge was lost when Native American communities were forced from their traditional territories. The genetic influence techniques required consistent application over decades or centuries. They couldn't be maintained when communities were displaced or prevented from practicing traditional land management. The genetic changes that Native Americans had created in local mosquito populations largely disappeared within a few generations of European colonization. We lost not just the knowledge of how to create these changes, but the actual beneficial mosquito populations that had taken centuries to develop. It's like losing a library of genetic modifications that could have provided natural, sustainable mosquito control for the benefit of all inhabitants, Native American and European alike. But what's truly extraordinary is that this genetic influence was just one component of an even larger system of mosquito warfare that encompassed not just individual techniques, but entire military-style strategies that could protect whole communities while simultaneously weakening enemy mosquito populations. And those battlefield tactics reveal a level of strategic thinking that would make Sun Tzu himself envious. Deep in the Florida Everglades, something unprecedented was happening that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about ancient warfare tactics. The year was 1835, and the US Army was preparing for what they expected to be a quick campaign against the Seminole people. General Winfield Scott had assembled over 5,000 troops, the largest military force ever deployed against Native Americans at that time. They had superior weapons, military training, and overwhelming numbers. What they didn't expect was to be defeated by an enemy they couldn't even see. And I'm not talking about the Seminole warriors. I'm talking about mosquitoes that had been weaponized through centuries of strategic environmental manipulation. Major General Thomas Jesup's military reports, preserved in the National Archives, tell a story of complete military collapse that had nothing to do with traditional combat. Jessup wrote, "We have lost more men to flying insects than to enemy action. Our troops are incapacitated by fever and flux, while the Seminoles move through the same terrain unaffected. It is as if the very air fights against us." What Jessup didn't understand was that he had walked his army into the world's first biological warfare zone, an environment that had been carefully engineered over centuries to be lethal to outsiders, while remaining perfectly habitable for those who understood its secrets. Let me explain how this incredible military strategy actually worked. The Seminole hadn't just learned to survive in mosquito territory, they had learned to weaponize it. According to ethnographer Minnie Moore Wilson's documentation of Seminole oral histories in the 1890s, they had developed what they called swamp war medicine, systematic techniques for using mosquito-borne diseases as a defensive weapon. The strategy was brilliantly simple. Lure enemy forces into carefully selected high mosquito areas, while using their traditional protection techniques to remain healthy themselves. It was biological warfare using entirely natural systems, and it was devastatingly effective. US Army medical records from the Seminole Wars show casualty rates that are almost impossible to believe. In some companies, over 90% of soldiers became incapacitated by mosquito-borne diseases within weeks of entering Seminole territory. Meanwhile, Seminole communities in the same areas maintained normal health and activity levels. The most incredible part? The Seminole had mapped the mosquito battlefield with scientific precision. According to Moore Wilson's research, Seminole war leaders had created detailed knowledge maps of mosquito density throughout the Everglades. They knew which areas had the highest concentrations of malaria-carrying mosquitoes, which had yellow fever vectors, and which had dengue fever risks. They could predict seasonal variations, weather-related changes, and even daily fluctuation patterns. When US forces approached, Seminole's strategy was to retreat into areas they knew would be lethal to unprotected troops, while remaining manageable for people using traditional protection techniques. It was like having home field advantage in a stadium designed to kill visiting teams. Spanish military engineer Lieutenant Colonel José Simón Sánchez, who had fought the Seminole earlier, wrote in 1821, "These people have turned their swampland into a fortress more impregnable than any castle. They do not fight us with weapons. They fight us with the very air we breathe." But the Seminole tactics went far beyond simple area denial. They had developed what modern military strategists would recognize as area interdiction, the ability to make specific territories completely impassable to enemy forces. According to Seminole oral histories, they had techniques for temporarily increasing mosquito populations in strategic areas when enemy forces were approaching. One method involved manipulating water levels around known mosquito breeding sites. By creating temporary flooding in specific areas, they could trigger massive mosquito hatches timed to coincide with enemy troop movements. It was like being able to call in airstrikes using biological weapons. Another technique involved using their sophisticated knowledge of mosquito behavioral patterns to predict exactly when and where mosquito density would be highest. then timing their military movements to drive enemy forces into these natural kill zones. The psychological effect was devastating. Army surgeon Dr. Nathan Jarvis wrote from Florida in 1836, "The men speak of the flying demons with more terror than they do of Seminole warriors. Many refuse to enter certain areas, claiming the very air is cursed. Morale has collapsed entirely." But perhaps the most brilliant aspect of this biological warfare was its sustainability. Unlike conventional military tactics that deplete resources, the Seminole mosquito warfare strategy actually strengthened over time. The longer conflicts lasted, the more refined their knowledge became. They learned exactly which enemy tactics were most vulnerable to mosquito attack, which seasons provided the best biological weapon advantages, and how to maximize enemy casualties while minimizing their own exposure. The results speak for themselves. The Second Seminole War lasted 7 years, the longest and most expensive Indian War in US history. Despite overwhelming military superiority, the US Army was never able to achieve decisive victory against an enemy that could turn the environment itself into a weapon. And this wasn't just a Seminole innovation. The Choctaw people had developed similar environmental warfare techniques in Louisiana and Mississippi. French colonial military reports from the 1720s describe Choctaw tactics that use seasonal mosquito patterns to defend their territory against European expansion. French military commander Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville wrote, "The Choctaw seem to possess supernatural knowledge of when the flying pests will be most severe. They time their military actions to coincide with seasons when we French cannot effectively operate, while they themselves remain unaffected." The Choctaw had identified that certain weather patterns, particularly during spring flooding, created optimal conditions for mosquito-borne disease transmission. They would time their defensive actions to take advantage of these natural biological weapon windows. Spanish colonial records from Florida show similar patterns with other tribes. The A's people of the Atlantic coast had developed techniques for using salt marsh mosquito populations as territorial defense systems. The Calusa of southwest Florida had learned to manipulate freshwater mosquito breeding areas to create biological barriers against invasion. It was a continental network of environmental warfare knowledge that European military forces were completely unprepared to counter. But here's what makes this even more remarkable. These weren't desperate last-resort tactics. They were sophisticated military strategies that had been developed and refined over centuries of intertribal conflict. Native American tribes had been using environmental warfare against each other long before Europeans arrived, perfecting techniques that proved devastatingly effective against colonial military forces. Cherokee oral histories, recorded by James Mooney, describe ancient conflicts where mosquito warfare played decisive roles. Certain territories were considered militarily valuable, not for their resources, but for their potential as biological weapons platforms against enemy forces. The Creek people had developed what they called summer war strategies that used peak mosquito seasons to attack enemy territories. They had learned that military campaigns timed to coincide with mosquito emergence patterns could achieve victory through disease rather than direct combat. Today, military historians are beginning to recognize these environmental warfare techniques as among the most sophisticated irregular warfare strategies ever developed. The use of biological weapon systems, area denial through disease vectors, and seasonal timing of biological attacks represent military innovations that were centuries ahead of their time. Dr. John Grenier's research on colonial warfare at the U.S. Air Force Academy has identified Native American environmental warfare as a major factor in limiting European colonial expansion. Areas where tribes had perfected mosquito warfare techniques remained unconquered or contested for decades longer than territories without these defenses. But what's truly extraordinary is that this biological warfare was just the defensive application of an even more comprehensive understanding, one that encompassed not just military strategy, but the ability to heal and protect their own communities from the very diseases they could weaponize against enemies. And that healing knowledge reveals medical innovations that put contemporary European medicine to shame. The most shocking discovery in our entire journey came when I realized that while European colonists were dying from diseases they couldn't even name, Native Americans had developed medical treatments that were centuries ahead of anything available in Europe. In 1763, British Army surgeon Dr. James Lind was desperately trying to save soldiers dying from what he called intermittent fever in the Great Lakes region. His medical journal, preserved in the British military archives, paints a picture of complete helplessness. We have lost 400 men to this mysterious ailment that brings shaking, burning fever and delirium. Our bleeding and purging provide no relief, yet the Ottawa people in the same territory remain in perfect health. What Dr. Lind didn't know was that he was witnessing the practical application of medical knowledge that wouldn't be understood by European science for another century. The Ottawa had treatments for malaria, yellow fever, and dengue that were more effective than anything in European medicine. And here's what's truly mind-blowing about this medical knowledge. The Cherokee had developed what ethnobotanist James Mooney documented as a complete pharmacological system for treating mosquito-borne diseases. In his extensive work, Sacred Formulas of the Cherokee, Mooney recorded over 30 different plant-based treatments for what Cherokee healers called flying sickness spirits. But these weren't just folk remedies. Modern chemical analysis has revealed that Cherokee anti-malarial treatments contained compounds that are virtually identical to quinine, the primary anti-malarial drug used in European medicine. The difference: Cherokee had been using these treatments for over 1,000 years before Europeans even knew malaria existed. Dr. Walter Lewis's research at Washington University analyzed traditional Cherokee fever medicines and found compounds including quinine alkaloids, febrifugine, and other antimalarial agents that matched or exceeded the effectiveness of contemporary European treatments. The Cherokee had essentially developed a complete medical system for mosquito-borne disease management without ever understanding germ theory or having microscopes. They did it through careful observation, systematic experimentation, and generations of accumulated knowledge. But the Cherokee weren't alone in this medical sophistication. The Choctaw people had developed what French colonial physician Dr. Alexandre Lepage Dupratz described in 1758 as miraculous fever cures. Dupratz, working in Louisiana, documented Choctaw treatments that could break malarial fevers within hours, something European medicine couldn't achieve. Dupratz wrote, "I have witnessed the Indian physicians cure intermittent fevers that our European methods cannot touch. Their plant medicines work with such speed and effectiveness that it seems supernatural, yet they assure me it is merely proper knowledge of forest pharmacy." Modern analysis of traditional Choctaw fever medicines has revealed sophisticated combinations of willow bark, containing salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin, cinchona-like compounds, natural quinine, and immune-boosting plant alkaloids that created comprehensive treatment protocols. And here's what's really remarkable about these traditional treatments. They weren't just treating symptoms. They were addressing the underlying disease processes with scientific precision that European medicine wouldn't achieve until the 20th century. The Seminole had developed what they called swamp medicine, treatment specifically designed for the multiple mosquito-borne diseases endemic to Florida. Spanish colonial records from the 1600s describe Seminole healers who could treat yellow fever, dengue, and malaria simultaneously using complex plant formulations. Dr. Francisco Hernandez, royal physician to Spain, spent years studying with Seminole healers and documented their techniques in his massive work, Historia Natural de Nueva España. Hernandez wrote, "These people possess medical knowledge that surpasses our European understanding. They can cure fevers that kill our strongest men, using plants we dismiss as weeds." Hernandez identified over 40 plants used in traditional Seminole fever treatments, many of which contained active compounds that modern pharmacology recognizes as effective anti-malarial, anti-inflammatory, and immune-supporting agents. But perhaps the most incredible medical innovation came from the Ojibwe. The Ojibwe had developed what they called mashkiki, a comprehensive system of preventive and curative medicine for mosquito diseases. According to Francis Densmore's extensive documentation, mashkiki included not just treatments for active disease, but prophylactic medicines that could prevent mosquito-borne illnesses entirely. Jesuit missionary Jacques Marquette, traveling with Ojibwe guides in 1673, noted, "These people take certain medicines before entering fever country that protect them from the diseases that kill Europeans. I have taken their medicines myself and remained healthy in areas where other French have perished." Modern research has identified that traditional Ojibwe preventive medicines contained natural compounds that boost immune system function, inhibit parasite reproduction, and enhance liver function, essentially creating comprehensive protection against mosquito-borne disease infection. Dr. Daniel Moorman's analysis of traditional Native American medicines in Native American ethnobotany found that Ojibwe preventive treatments contained over 15 different bioactive compounds that work synergistically to prevent malaria, dengue, and other mosquito-borne infections. And the sophistication of these medical systems went far beyond just plant knowledge. Native American healers had developed diagnostic techniques that allowed them to identify different mosquito-borne diseases and tailor treatments accordingly. Cherokee healers could distinguish between malaria and dengue fever based on symptom patterns and provide disease-specific treatments. They understood concepts like drug resistance and treatment timing that European medicine wouldn't recognize for centuries. Cherokee protocols included rotating different medicines to prevent treatment resistance and timing dosages to match disease cycles. They had developed combination therapies that addressed multiple aspects of mosquito-borne diseases simultaneously, treating the infection, supporting immune function, managing symptoms, and preventing complications. Today, pharmaceutical companies are desperately trying to synthesize the compounds that Native American healers had been using for centuries. Companies like Pfizer and GlaxoSmithKline have research programs specifically focused on traditional Native American anti-malarial medicines. But here's the tragic irony. While European colonists were dismissing Native American medicine as primitive superstition, they were dying from diseases that native healers could easily cure. The cultural arrogance that prevented Europeans from learning traditional medical knowledge cost thousands of lives. Spanish physician Dr. Francisco López de Gomara wrote in frustration in 1552, "We lose many good Christians to fevers that the Indians cure with simple plant medicines. Yet our pride prevents us from learning from those we consider our inferiors in all things." The knowledge was right there, proven effective over thousands of years, but European prejudice made it inaccessible to the very people who needed it most. And much of this medical knowledge was lost when Native American communities were disrupted by colonization. Traditional healing knowledge required continuous practice and transmission from elder healers to apprentices. When communities were displaced and traditional practices suppressed, centuries of accumulated medical wisdom disappeared. Today, as we face increasing challenges from mosquito-borne diseases like Zika, West Nile virus, and resurgent malaria, researchers are desperately trying to recover this lost knowledge. The World Health Organization now recognizes traditional Native American medicine as a valuable source of new anti-malarial drugs. But what's really going to amaze you is discovering that this sophisticated medical knowledge was just one part of an even larger crisis that reveals how the systematic destruction of Native American wisdom created problems that we're still struggling with today. And understanding what we lost reveals why our modern approach to mosquito control is failing so dramatically. Here's where our story takes its most disturbing turn, revealing how the systematic destruction of Native American knowledge created the very mosquito crisis that's killing people around the world today. The statistics are absolutely staggering. According to the World Health Organization's 2023 report, mosquito-borne diseases now kill over 1 million people annually, more than any other vector-borne illness. West Nile virus cases in the United States have increased by 400% since 2000. Zika virus emerged seemingly out of nowhere to cause global panic. Eastern equine encephalitis is spreading to areas where it was never seen before. But here's what's going to shock you. None of this had to happen. We had the solutions. We destroyed them. Let me show you exactly what we lost and when we lost it. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, forcing Native American tribes from their ancestral territories across the southeastern United States. What history books don't tell you is that this wasn't just a human tragedy. It was an ecological disaster that dismantled the most sophisticated mosquito management systems ever developed. The Cherokee Nation, forced from their homeland in Georgia and the Carolinas, had spent over 1,000 years creating what ecologists now call managed landscapes, environments where human activity and natural ecosystems work together to control mosquito populations naturally. Dr. William Cronin's research in Changes in the Land documents how Cherokee land management practices had created what European observers called park-like landscapes, with remarkably low mosquito populations. But within a decade of Cherokee removal, these same areas became mosquito-infested wastelands that European settlers found nearly uninhabitable. The problem was that Cherokee mosquito management wasn't just about individual techniques. It was about entire ecosystem management that took generations to establish and maintain. Cherokee communities had strategically placed settlements, managed water flows, maintained specific plant communities, and created habitat conditions that naturally suppressed mosquito populations while supporting human activities. When the Cherokee were removed, these managed ecosystems collapsed within a few years, and the consequences were immediate and devastating. Medical records from Georgia and the Carolinas show dramatic increases in malaria, yellow fever, and other mosquito-borne diseases in the decades following Cherokee removal. Areas that had been healthy for centuries became known as fever country, that killed European settlers and enslaved Africans alike. Dr. Todd Savitt's research on disease patterns in the antebellum South shows that mosquito-borne disease mortality rates in former Cherokee territories increased by over 300% in the 20 years following removal. The very lands that Europeans coveted became death traps without the ecological knowledge that had made them habitable. But the Cherokee weren't the only victims of this ecological catastrophe. The Seminole removal attempts in Florida created similar disasters when the U.S. government tried to force Seminole communities from the Everglades. They weren't just displacing people, they were destroying centuries of sophisticated wetland management that had kept mosquito-borne diseases under control. Seminole communities had developed what modern ecologists recognize as constructed wetlands, engineered water management systems that controlled mosquito breeding while supporting other wildlife. These systems required constant maintenance and traditional knowledge to function properly. When Seminole communities were disrupted, their wetland management systems collapsed. Areas of Florida that had been successfully inhabited for centuries became uninhabitable even for European settlers who had superior military technology and medical knowledge. U.S. Army Medical Officer Dr. Benjamin King wrote from Florida in 1842, "The very lands we sought to clear of Indians have become too dangerous for our own occupation. The fever swamps that were once their homes now defeat our strongest men within days." And this pattern repeated itself across the continent. The forced removal of Great Lakes tribes disrupted mosquito management systems that had kept the northern wilderness accessible for trade and travel. French voyageurs who had successfully navigated these regions for generations suddenly found traditional routes impassable due to mosquito-borne diseases. The displacement of plains tribes interrupted sophisticated seasonal migration patterns that had managed mosquito populations across vast territories. Areas that had supported large indigenous populations became known as fever country, that limited European settlement for decades. The destruction of Pacific Northwest tribal communities eliminated knowledge systems that had maintained delicate balance between human activity and mosquito control in complex coastal ecosystems. But here's what makes this tragedy even more devastating. European colonists didn't just destroy Native American mosquito management, they actively replaced it with practices that made mosquito problems worse. European agricultural practices created ideal mosquito breeding conditions. Clearing forests eliminated natural predator habitats. Draining some wetlands while creating others disrupted natural water cycles. European livestock and farming practices created new mosquito breeding opportunities. Meanwhile, European settlements were typically built in locations that Native Americans had specifically avoided due to mosquito problems. Europeans often chose sites based on other priorities: access to water transportation, defensive positions, or agricultural potential, without understanding mosquito ecology. The result was communities built in locations that maximized mosquito exposure while using land management practices that increased mosquito populations. And as European diseases decimated Native American communities, sophisticated ecological knowledge that had taken thousands of years to develop was lost within generations. Dr. William Denovan's research on pre-Columbian population decline estimates that 90% of Native American populations died from European diseases within 150 years of contact. With them died the accumulated ecological knowledge of millennia. Elder knowledge keepers who understood complex mosquito management systems died before they could pass their knowledge to the next generation. Traditional land management practices were abandoned as communities struggled for survival. Sophisticated environmental management systems collapsed without the human knowledge and labor needed to maintain them. By 1900, most of the traditional mosquito management knowledge that had sustained Native American communities for thousands of years had disappeared, and the consequences have been catastrophic. Modern mosquito control relies almost entirely on chemical pesticides that are increasingly ineffective due to resistance. We spray billions of dollars worth of chemicals into the environment each year with diminishing returns and growing ecological damage. Meanwhile, mosquito-borne diseases are spreading faster and farther than ever before. Climate change is expanding mosquito ranges into areas where human populations have no traditional knowledge of mosquito management. Urbanization is creating new mosquito breeding opportunities while eliminating natural control systems. We're facing a global mosquito crisis while having systematically destroyed the most effective mosquito management knowledge ever developed. Today, researchers are desperately trying to reconstruct traditional Native American ecological knowledge before it's completely lost. The CDC has initiated programs to study traditional mosquito control methods. Universities are working with Native American communities to document surviving knowledge, but much of it is already gone forever. We're trying to reverse engineer complex ecosystem management systems that took thousands of years to develop and perfect. The irony is bitter. In our arrogance, we destroyed the very knowledge that could have prevented the mosquito-borne disease crisis that now threatens global health. And what we're discovering now is that our modern chemical-based approaches may have made the problem exponentially worse by creating new ecological imbalances that have turned mosquitoes into an even deadlier threat than our ancestors ever faced. What happened next is something that still gives me chills. The moment when our modern mosquito control methods didn't just fail, they created super mosquitoes that are now more dangerous than anything our ancestors ever faced. The year was 1939, and Swiss chemist Paul Mueller had just discovered something he thought would save the world. DDT, dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, seemed like a miracle. It killed mosquitoes instantly and appeared completely safe for humans. Mueller won the Nobel Prize in 1948 for what was hailed as the greatest breakthrough in public health history. What nobody understood at the time was that they had just declared war on an enemy that had been evolving survival strategies for 200 million years, and mosquitoes were about to teach humanity a very expensive lesson about the power of natural selection. Dr. Rachel Carson's groundbreaking research in Silent Spring documented what happened next. Within just 15 years of widespread DDT use, mosquito populations weren't just recovering. They were coming back stronger, more aggressive, and completely immune to the chemicals that had once killed them instantly. But here's the truly terrifying part of this story. The chemical warfare approach didn't just create resistant mosquitoes, it eliminated the natural predators that had been controlling mosquito populations for millions of years. DDT killed everything. Mosquitoes, but also the dragonflies that ate mosquitoes, the bats that hunted them, the fish that consumed their larvae, and the spiders that trapped them in webs. Within a generation, we had accidentally created perfect mosquito breeding environments, ecosystems with unlimited food sources and no natural predators. Dr. Thomas Scott's research at UC Davis found that mosquito populations in DDT-treated areas eventually became 300 to 500% higher than in untreated areas once resistance developed. We had literally made the problem exponentially worse, and this wasn't just an American problem. The World Health Organization's global malaria eradication program of the 1950s and 1960s relied entirely on DDT spraying. Initial results were spectacular. Malaria cases dropped dramatically across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. But then something horrifying happened. Not only did mosquitoes develop resistance to DDT, but the malaria parasites themselves began evolving resistance to anti-malarial drugs. We had inadvertently created a two-pronged evolutionary arms race, resistant mosquitoes carrying resistant parasites. Dr. Peter Gething's analysis for the Malaria Atlas Project found that by the 1970s, malaria cases in areas that had undergone intensive chemical treatment were actually higher than pre-treatment levels. The combination of resistant mosquitoes and resistant parasites created what epidemiologists call rebound malaria, outbreaks more severe than anything seen before chemical intervention. But the nightmare was just beginning. As DDT was banned due to environmental concerns, the chemical industry developed new pesticides, organophosphates, carbamates, pyrethroids. Each time the same pattern repeated: initial success, followed by resistance, followed by stronger mosquito populations than before. Today's mosquitoes have been through nearly a century of chemical selection pressure. They're not just resistant to pesticides, they're what entomologists call super survivors. Modern mosquito populations can tolerate chemical concentrations that would have killed their ancestors instantly. Dr. Janet Hemingway's research at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine has identified mosquito populations that are resistant to all 4 major classes of insecticides currently approved for public health use. We're rapidly approaching what researchers call the resistance cliff, the point where chemical control becomes completely ineffective. And here's where this gets really scary. These chemical-resistant super mosquitoes aren't just surviving our pesticides, they're thriving in environments that our chemical approach has created. Modern urban environments, with their standing water, reduced predator populations, and chemical-treated landscapes, are perfect mosquito habitat. Cities like Miami, Houston, and Phoenix now have mosquito populations that are larger and more aggressive than anything seen in these areas historically. We've essentially created mosquito paradise while destroying the natural systems that once kept them in check. Dr. Gonzalo Vázquez Procopec's research at Emory University found that urbanization combined with chemical mosquito control has increased mosquito-human contact rates by up to 1,000% compared to pre-industrial levels. But perhaps the most disturbing development is what's happening with disease transmission. These super mosquitoes aren't just more numerous, they're more effective disease vectors. Chemical selection pressure has favored mosquitoes that feed more frequently, live longer, and are more aggressive in seeking human blood. Modern Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, the primary vectors for Zika, dengue, and yellow fever, now have faster reproduction cycles, higher survival rates, and enhanced disease transmission capabilities compared to their pre-chemical ancestors. Dr. Scott Weaver's research at the University of Texas Medical Branch found that contemporary mosquito populations can transmit arboviruses at rates 200–400% higher than mosquito populations from museum specimens collected before the chemical control era. It's as if our war against mosquitoes has created an army of biological weapons specifically evolved to defeat our defenses and maximize human disease transmission. And the economic cost of this failure is staggering. The CDC estimates that the United States alone spends over $2.7 billion annually on mosquito control, with diminishing returns each year. Globally, mosquito-borne diseases cost an estimated $12 billion annually in healthcare expenses and lost productivity. Meanwhile, traditional Native American mosquito management techniques that work sustainably for thousands of years have been almost entirely forgotten. But here's what's really going to shock you about our modern predicament. Climate change is now expanding the ranges of these super mosquitoes into areas where human populations have no historical experience with mosquito-borne diseases. Northern cities that never had to deal with serious mosquito problems are now seeing Aedes aegypti populations for the first time. These expanded mosquito ranges are encountering human populations that lack both traditional knowledge and natural immunity, creating perfect conditions for explosive disease outbreaks. Dr. Paul Reiter's research on climate and vector-borne diseases predicts that by 2050, over 5 billion people will be living in areas suitable for year-round transmission of mosquito-borne diseases, double the current number. We're facing a future where chemical-resistant super mosquitoes carrying drug-resistant diseases will threaten human populations that have no traditional knowledge of mosquito survival. It's the perfect storm of our own making, and it didn't have to happen this way. The indigenous communities we displaced and whose knowledge we destroyed had developed sustainable mosquito management systems that worked with natural selection instead of against it. They understood that trying to eliminate mosquitoes entirely was futile and counterproductive. Instead, they had learned to manage mosquito populations within tolerable levels, while maintaining the ecological balance that kept both mosquitoes and mosquito-borne diseases in check. Today, As we face the collapse of chemical control and the emergence of super mosquitoes, some researchers are finally beginning to study what remains of traditional ecological knowledge. But we may have waited too long to learn from the wisdom we so arrogantly dismissed. And what we're about to discover next reveals that some of the ancient techniques we thought were lost forever are still being practiced in hidden corners of the world by communities that never abandon the old ways and whose survival methods could be our salvation in the coming mosquito crisis. Against all odds, hidden in remote corners of our modern world, the ancient knowledge still survives, and what these last guardians of traditional wisdom are teaching us could revolutionize how we think about survival itself. In 2019, ethnobotanist Dr. Mark Miller was conducting field research in the Everglades when he made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Deep in areas most people considered uninhabitable, he found Seminole families still practicing traditional mosquito management techniques that had been passed down through generations despite centuries of cultural suppression. Elder Betty Mae Tiger, a traditional knowledge keeper, demonstrated techniques for Dr. Miller that seemed almost magical. She could walk through mosquito-infested swampland in the middle of summer, wearing only light clothing, completely unbothered by insects that were aggressively attacking Dr. Miller despite his DEET-soaked protective gear. "The plants still remember how to protect us," Elder Tiger explained to Dr. Miller. "We just have to remember how to ask them properly." What Dr. Miller documented was extraordinary. A complete traditional ecological knowledge system that had survived centuries of disruption and was still more effective than modern chemical approaches. But Elder Tiger's community wasn't alone in preserving this ancient wisdom. In northern Minnesota, Ojibwe elder Mary Genius has spent decades documenting traditional plant knowledge that includes sophisticated mosquito management techniques. Her work, published in Plants Have So Much to Give Us, reveals that traditional Ojibwe communities never abandoned their mosquito survival methods. They just practiced them quietly, away from outside attention. Genius's research found that Ojibwe families using traditional techniques had significantly lower rates of mosquito-borne disease exposure compared to neighbouring non-native communities, even in areas with identical mosquito populations. "Our ancestors didn't just survive with mosquitoes," Genius explained. "They learned to live in balance with them. That knowledge never died. It just went underground like our sacred medicines." And in the Pacific Northwest, something equally remarkable was happening. Dr. Nancy Turner's extensive ethnobotanical work with coastal tribes documented the continuation of traditional mosquito management practices among Kino and Makah communities. These techniques had been maintained as part of broader traditional ecological knowledge systems that encompassed everything from seasonal fishing to forest management. What Dr. Turner found was that native communities practicing traditional land management had naturally lower mosquito populations in their territories compared to adjacent areas managed using modern techniques. The traditional burning practices, plant cultivation methods, and water management systems that tribes had maintained for cultural and spiritual reasons were incidentally providing mosquito control that surpassed anything achieved by chemical methods. But here's what's truly remarkable about these surviving knowledge systems. They're not just historical artifacts, they're dynamic, evolving approaches that traditional knowledge keepers have been adapting to modern challenges. Cherokee botanist David Kozzo has been working to integrate traditional plant knowledge with contemporary organic farming techniques, creating mosquito management systems that work in modern suburban environments. Kozzo's research found that suburban yards managed using adapted traditional techniques had 70 to 80% fewer mosquitoes than chemically treated properties, while also supporting more biodiversity and requiring less maintenance. Traditional knowledge isn't about living in the past, Kodzo explained. It's about applying ancient wisdom to modern challenges. The plants still work the same way. We just need to understand how to use them in contemporary contexts. And these modern applications are proving incredibly effective. The city of Tucson, Arizona, partnered with the Tohono O'odham Nation to pilot traditional desert water management techniques for mosquito control. The program, documented by Dr. Gary Paul Narban, achieved 90% reduction in mosquito breeding sites, while actually improving local water quality and wildlife habitat. Traditional techniques that had sustained desert communities for thousands of years proved more effective and less expensive than chemical control methods, while providing additional environmental benefits that chemical approaches couldn't match. In Florida, the Seminole tribe has been working with researchers to develop integrated mosquito management programs that combine traditional ecological knowledge with modern monitoring techniques. These hybrid approaches are achieving mosquito control rates that exceed purely chemical methods, while eliminating the environmental damage and resistance problems associated with pesticide use. But perhaps the most exciting development is happening in urban environments. Landscape architect and Cherokee botanist Enrique Salmon has developed what he calls indigenous permaculture, urban design principles based on traditional ecological knowledge that naturally control mosquito populations while creating beautiful, productive community spaces. Salmon's designs use traditional plant combinations and water management techniques to create urban environments that are naturally mosquito-resistant. Parks and community gardens designed using these principles have 60–70% fewer mosquitoes than conventional urban spaces while requiring no chemical inputs. Cities don't have to be mosquito breeding grounds, Salmon explains. Indigenous knowledge shows us how to design human settlements that work with natural systems instead of against them. And this revival of traditional knowledge is happening at exactly the right time. As climate change expands mosquito ranges and chemical resistance makes conventional control methods less effective, traditional ecological approaches offer sustainable alternatives that become more effective over time instead of less effective. Research programs at universities across the country are now partnering with Native American communities to document, preserve, and adapt traditional mosquito management knowledge. The University of Arizona's Traditional Medicine Program, the University of Washington's Ethnobotany Initiative, and similar programs at dozens of other institutions are racing to record knowledge that was almost lost forever. But the most important lesson these traditional knowledge keepers are teaching isn't just about mosquitoes. It's about fundamentally different ways of thinking about our relationship with the natural world. Traditional approaches don't try to eliminate mosquitoes. They focus on creating conditions where humans and mosquitoes can coexist with minimal conflict. This philosophy of coexistence rather than conquest offers a path forward that could solve not just mosquito problems, but many of the ecological challenges we face in the modern world. Elder Betty Mae Tiger put it best. When you try to kill everything, you end up killing yourself too. When you learn to live in balance, everyone can survive and thrive. Today, as we face escalating mosquito-borne disease threats and the failure of chemical control methods, these traditional knowledge systems offer hope. They represent thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about sustainable coexistence with one of our most challenging natural adversaries. The question now is whether we have the humility to learn from the knowledge we once dismissed, and the wisdom to apply these ancient solutions to our modern challenges. Because what we're about to discover in our final section reveals how you can actually use these time-tested techniques in your own life. Practical applications that could protect you and your family while helping to restore the natural balance we so desperately need. So here we are at the end of our incredible journey, and I want to leave you with something practical that could genuinely change your life. After 3 hours of exploring these ancient secrets, you're probably wondering, how can I actually use this knowledge today? The truth is, you can start implementing these time-tested techniques immediately, and some of them will shock you with their simplicity and effectiveness. Let's start with the easiest one that you can try tonight. The basic smoking technique that saved countless Native American lives is something you can adapt for modern camping or even your own backyard. You don't need exotic plants. Common herbs like rosemary, sage, or even dried mint leaves from your garden can create effective mosquito barriers when burned properly. But here's the crucial part that most people get wrong. It's not about creating huge, smoky fires. Traditional techniques use small, controlled smudge sources that created gentle smoke patterns. Think of it like natural incense rather than a bonfire. Dr. Catherine Tucker's research found that small rosemary smudge pots placed strategically around outdoor seating areas can reduce mosquito activity by up to 85%, more effective than most commercial mosquito coils and completely natural. For those of you who want to go deeper, plant-based repellents using ingredients you can find at any health food store are incredibly effective. Wild mint essential oil mixed with a carrier oil creates a natural repellent that lasts longer than DEET and actually improves with repeated use as it builds up on your skin. The Cherokee technique of using cedar oil mixed with sweetgrass can be adapted using easily available cedar essential oil and sweet grass that you can order online or find at many Native American cultural centers that sell traditional medicines. But remember, and this is important, always research proper dilution rates and test small amounts first. Essential oils are powerful plant medicines that need to be treated with respect. And here's something you can implement in your own yard. Traditional water management techniques can dramatically reduce mosquito breeding around your home. Instead of using chemicals, focus on eliminating standing water and creating gentle water movement. A simple solar fountain in a bird bath creates the water circulation that prevents mosquito breeding while attracting mosquito-eating birds. Plant mosquito-repelling native plants around outdoor seating areas. Depending on your region, this might include wild mint, native sages, or other traditional plants that local native communities have used for centuries. The timing knowledge we explored can help you plan outdoor activities. Most mosquito species are least active during the middle of the day when temperatures are highest. Plan your outdoor gatherings accordingly, and you'll automatically reduce mosquito encounters without any other intervention. But here's what I really want you to understand. These techniques work because they're based on thousands of years of careful observation and testing. They've survived because they're effective, sustainable, and safe when used properly. The Native Americans who developed these methods weren't just randomly trying things. They were conducting sophisticated experiments over generations, refining techniques until they achieved remarkable effectiveness. And that brings me to the most important lesson of our entire journey. We live in a time when we have access to both ancient wisdom and modern scientific understanding. We don't have to choose between traditional knowledge and contemporary research. We can combine the best of both approaches. The future of mosquito management isn't going to come from more powerful chemicals or genetic engineering alone. It's going to come from rediscovering sustainable approaches that work with natural systems instead of against them. Traditional Native American techniques offer us a path forward that's more effective, more sustainable, and safer for our families and our environment than the chemical warfare approach that's clearly failing. But perhaps most importantly, this story teaches us about the incredible value of indigenous knowledge systems that we've barely begun to understand or appreciate. Every technique we've explored tonight represents generations of careful observation, experimentation, and refinement. This wasn't primitive trial and error. This was sophisticated science applied over thousands of years to develop solutions that remain superior to our modern approaches. And this knowledge exists across every aspect of sustainable living, not just mosquito control, but agriculture, medicine, architecture, ecology, and countless other fields where indigenous communities developed incredibly advanced solutions to challenges we're still struggling with today. The tragedy is that so much of this knowledge has been lost, but the hope is that some of it survives, and we're finally beginning to recognize its value before it disappears entirely. Communities across the country are working to preserve and revive traditional ecological knowledge. If you're interested in learning more, look for programs at universities in your area that work with local Native American communities. Many tribes now offer educational workshops that share traditional knowledge with the broader community. But most importantly, approach this knowledge with respect and humility. These aren't just interesting historical facts. They're sophisticated technologies developed by brilliant people who understood their environments in ways that we're only beginning to appreciate. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about the incredible ingenuity of the people who came before us. Think about the Cherokee elders who perfected smoke techniques that modern science is still trying to understand. Think about the Seminole families who turned deadly swamps into comfortable homes. Think about the Ojibwe communities who developed timing systems more accurate than our weather forecasts. And remember that their descendants are still here, still preserving this knowledge, still willing to share it with those who approach with genuine respect and desire to learn. The next time you're bothered by mosquitoes, remember that you have options beyond chemical warfare. You have access to thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about coexisting with these ancient adversaries, and who knows, maybe by rediscovering these traditional approaches, we can begin to heal not just our relationship with mosquitoes, but our relationship with the natural world itself. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through one of the most fascinating chapters in human survival history. The dedication and curiosity of listeners like you make it possible for me to research and share these amazing stories. I hope you've found tonight's exploration as eye-opening as I have. Sleep well, knowing that you now possess knowledge that could quite literally save your life in the wilderness, and might even make your next camping trip a lot more comfortable. And get ready for our next adventure together, because I've discovered another incredible survival story that's going to completely change how you think about human ingenuity and ancient wisdom. Until then, sweet dreams,